Those who know the truth must teach. African proverb. We must emancipate our minds from mental slavery. None but ourselves can do so. That quote was originally made by Marcus Garvey and then made popular when Bob Marley included it in his song entitled Redemption Song. The quote is well known by Africans throughout the entire diaspora. Although millions of Africans globally knows the quote, we've largely remained complacent in regard to the actual emancipation of our minds from white mental slavery. To truly emancipate our minds from white mental slavery, we must first acknowledge and recognize the fact that when the white society invaded, colonized, and enslaved our African ancestors, they also indoctrinated many mental enslaving lies into their minds. Those lies are called mental enslaving lies because they manipulated our ancestors to think in ways that were against their own interests and that instead served the interests of the white society. Those lies and the ideology surrounding those lies was subsequently passed down to we current Africans throughout the diaspora. We must also acknowledge that since their invasion of Africa, the white society has never relinquished its monopoly over information that are fed into the minds of Africans. They are presently white government agents that specialize in psychiatry and propaganda that works unrelentingly behind the scenes, manipulating the collective minds of the black masses. Through their monopoly over the education we're taught, the media images we see, and the societal narratives that we repetitively hear, these men govern our minds, molds our opinions, and shapes our perceptions in ways that serves and protects the interests of the white society. This is our hidden reality. This is all possible because regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the input into the collective minds of a targeted population, it's entirely possible to control what the targeted population will believe. The human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it's possible to control the input into the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, it's entirely possible to control what a person will think. The white society has exploited its monopoly over the input of information that are fed into the collective minds of black people to persuade an entire generation of black people to think in ways that serves and protects the system of white supremacy. The reason for this is because there's an immense fear of massive unified black retribution that secretly exists amongst those white nations that have brutally exploited Africans for many centuries. This immense fear resulted in white social scientists and white propagandists deploying propaganda campaigns that manipulate the collective minds of Africans to think in ways that prevent us from seeking retribution against the white society. Renowned activist Noam Chomsky has been speaking on this subject for many decades. He said that given the legacy of black enslavement and subjugation by the white society, that there's a fear that the black victims might rise up and take revenge against the white society. He said that the white society is deeply imbued with fears that Africans throughout the diaspora will someday repay violence and oppression that has marred our history. This immense fear resulted in the white society deploying methods for manipulating the minds of the black masses to think in ways that prevents this pending retribution. Noam Chomsky says that the general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't even know it doesn't know. During the Carter administration, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a national security advisor and political scientist, warned President Jimmy Carter and all Western leaders that they had to do everything possible within their power to prevent Africans throughout the diaspora from unifying. They must keep us divided. They don't want us to unify politically, culturally, or economically. When Africans are divided globally, we lose our global numerical advantage and we're stripped of all hopes of defeating global white supremacy. When Africans are kept divided globally, this allows the white society to continue its exploitation of Africa's natural resources without any black global resistance. The white society's exploitation of Africans has provided with an era which has flourished most throughout history. To allow this era to end would be directly against the interests of the white society. This manipulating system allows the white society to continue its exploitation and subjugation of Africans without significant global black resistance. To not have done this to Africans would have placed the white society in direct conflict of its own self-interest. Don't be fooled by the Western world's distorted media depictions of Africa. Africa itself is not poor. It is in fact the richest continent on earth. There's billions to be made and carved out of Africa. The white society has been exploiting Africa's natural resources for 500 years. It's only many African nations that remains poor due to the Western world's exploitation of Africa and through their unfair trade rules. The truth is that Africa is not underdeveloped, it's overexploited. The capitalist Europeans and North American power have taken the gold, the diamond, the tin, the iron, the copper, the rubber, the cocoa, and even coltan from Africa. Coltan is an African mineral that makes sure our smartphones work, laptops work, and other electronic devices. African provides commodity to the biggest companies around the world. Yet in spite of this fact, many parts of Africa remains impoverished because of white rules. Many have asked, how is it possible that parts of Africa remain so impoverished, even though Europe has been trading with Africans? The reason is because the real benefit in trade is finished goods, but Africans are not able to sell finished goods without being charged tariff and other taxes that makes their product unaffordable for other countries. This prevents Africans from doing anything except growing raw products sold at the prices that the Westerners control. Africans aren't able to can their own fruits, juice their own oranges, or sell their own cocoa powder. These are Western trade rules that keep Africans in poverty, and it is wrong. The exploitation by Africans, by the Western world, they've been doing this since 1500, and it has made an invaluable contribution to the building of Western civilization. Moreover, the ongoing exploitation of Africa is actually essential for the survival of the Western world. The true hidden fact is that the Western world cannot sustain itself for more than 2 years without Africa's natural resources. Therefore, if the Western society did not keep Africans divided globally, which allows the white society to continue its exploitation of Africa without any global black resistance, it would then be against their own self-interest. Here's how the white propagandists turned many Native Africans against African Americans. The media images shown to Native Africans of we African Americans are those that depicts African Americans in an unflattering, buffoonery, and culturally disconnected manner. Furthermore, African Americans are made to appear as criminals and thugs and as being a part of a treacherous, frightening, and almost insane fringe. These images reinforces negative stereotypes about African Americans and produces fear among the Native Africans in regard to we African Americans. It should therefore come as no surprise that many Native Africans come to America with negative opinions about African Americans. Many of them who come here looking down at African Americans. Excuse me. As a result of these media depictions, some Native Africans come to the United States feeling that they are inherently better and they don't want their children to marry Native African Americans. You know, for some Native Africans, the manipulation process is so strong that they insist that the children not marry African Americans. You know, many Native Africans have also given reports of being told by the government immigration officials upon arriving in the U.S. to stay clear of African Americans. Now, here's how they've turned many African Americans against Native Africans. During the 1960s, African Americans had begun strongly embracing an African identity. Many started declaring our love for Africa, started wearing afros, braids, dashiki, and giving ourselves African names. African Americans' allegiance towards Africa was very strong during the decades of the 60s. Now, to the contrary, millions of African Americans prefer to be called a nigger rather than an African. Many literally become angry when called an African, but smile when called a nigger. This profound change within the African American culture is by deliberate design. It's by deliberate design, the propaganda campaign to change, to divide us. White social scientists determined during the 1960s that millions of African Americans had developed a romanticized view of Africa. Furthermore, that this romanticized view of Africa fueled the Black Power and Black Pride movement. They also determined that African Americans' allegiance towards Africa hindered the growth of Black patriotism towards the U.S. They concluded that in order for African Americans' allegiance to the U.S. to grow, that our allegiance towards Africa had to be eroded. To meet this objective, white propaganda designers were hired to turn Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for African Americans. They achieved this by constantly inundating African Americans with media images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly illiterate, and disease-stricken Africa, the babies with the flies all over the face. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this manipulates millions of African Americans to feel not only ashamed of Africa, but to feel grateful for the enslavement of our ancestors. Because the perception has become that slavery rescued us from the backwardness of Africa. This increased Black allegiance towards the U.S. and dissuades us from even pursuing the reparations we're still owed, because we see it as a rescue mission. Some African Americans have been so heavily demoralized by the white society's humiliated depiction of Africa that many will accept any fable that allows them to claim themselves as being anything other than an African. This is why so many African Americans have embraced the false narratives that they're not Africans, although countless millions of us have taken DNA analysis that have scientifically confirmed our African identity. You know, this psychologists call this disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and the white society's negative depiction of Africa. All long-term demoralizing psychological warfare campaigns leave damages to their targeted populations. This propaganda campaign also prevents Africans, as I said earlier, from pursuing the reparation debt that we're still owed, because we literally feel grateful to the white society for enslaving our ancestors because they rescued us. It's always by design when the oppressed starts thinking in ways that benefits the white society. Many Black people say, I'm happy slavery happened. This psychological warfare campaign broke down African Americans' sense of Black racial heritage and allegiance towards Africa, thus meets the ruling elite's objective of divide and conquer globally. As I said earlier, when Africans are divided globally, we'll lose our global numeral advantage and lose all hopes of defeating global white supremacy. The more recent ideology that we Africans are not from Africa, but are instead the true Native Americans, is also it's also false propaganda designed to divide us from Africa. You know, Countless millions of African Americans have taken DNA analysis. And as I said earlier, our DNA analysis have all scientifically confirmed that we are Africans. Those 500-year-old bodies they find, when they do DNA testing on those 500-year-old Native Americans, those DNA does not match ours. Their DNA are consistent with those that we currently know to be Native Americans. We have to wake up and stop functioning based upon falsehood. We must stop being easy victims of the white propagandists, divide and conquer tactics. We must wake up to our reality. We have no true leaders anymore, so no one's addressing these things that's being done to us. The white society also divided us from Africa by telling us that most slaves were sold away. They did this by concealing the fact of all of the bodies of Africans that were murdered trying to rescue their loved ones from those slave ships. The white sands of the African beach were filled with African bodies lying on the beach, but we never hear those stories. The number of Africans that died in battles fought against the white invaders far exceeded many times over the number of the Africans that may have assisted in the slave trade. The hiding of these fierce battles and massacres is deliberately done to perpetuate the lie that most of our enslaved ancestors were merely sold away. To further convey the falsehood that most African slaves were sold away by other Africans, several white artists were hired to create pictures of Africans selling their fellow Africans to the white invaders. These propaganda arts are designed to shift the culpability of the African slave trade away from the white society and place it more upon we Africans. Those reproduction of those drawings and paintings are still found today within our textbooks. When you look in a textbook, you will see a black person holding a black person in chains. Therefore, every time that an African American student reads about the African slave trade, those pictures are placed there between the text, subliminally conveying the message that most of the African slaves were fairly purchased. To believe that the greedy white invaders went into Africa with weaponry advantages of guns and cannons, but rather than maximizing their profit, they instead purchased most of those slaves, is absolutely ridiculous. Because such a claim totally contradicts over 400 years of demonstrated evidence of Caucasians' behavior in regard to black people and making profit. Furthermore, critically think and ask yourself this question. If Africans owned all of the natural resources, Africans owned all the gold, the diamonds, the minerals, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa, and the West had nothing that Africans needed, how then was it possible that most of the white invaders purchased most of those millions of slaves? What possible commodity did they have that they could afford so their money had no value and Africans had all the diamonds, had all the golds? The narrative that most slaves were purchased is a whitewashing of history. Think, and why wouldn't the greedy white invaders maximize their profit by using their weaponry advantage of rifles and cannons to maximize their profit? Once you start critically thinking, look at facts as they truly were, it becomes clear that most slaves were not fairly purchased. The history we've been taught has been whitewashed to make us think in ways that serves the white society. Our problem is too many of us have normalized our mindset. The slave trade we've been taught has been distorted to shift the culpability away from the white society upon ourselves. This also ties in with the narrative that they want us to believe that it's always we that are our worst enemies. This is the reality. This propaganda campaign significantly eases African Americans' collective aggressions against the white society and redirect it towards ourselves. It also breaks down African Americans' sense of racial allegiance towards Africa. This is our hidden reality that we must wake up to. Brothers and sisters, it's time to wake up to our reality. There's a war that's being waged against our minds. And while white oppressive forces are playing chess, black people are playing hopscotch. That's right. We're not even playing checkers. We're not even on the board. We're playing hopscotch. Wake up. You know, the black Hebrew is also makes the global white supremacy stronger. The black Hebrews have actually done more for the benefit of global white supremacy than any black institution in history. They divide millions of black people in the U.S. from the over a billion in Africa by teaching their followers that we're not Africans. Although millions of DNA analysis have scientifically confirmed our African identity. You know, they also base this division based upon a story of Noah's son Ham and Shem. They claim that Africans are of Ham and that African Americans are of Shem. However, Shem and Ham never existed. It never happened. It's not even a Hebrew mythology. It's a totally unadulterated falsehood. The men who wrote the Bible plagiarized it from a Mesopotamian story called the Gilgamesh epic. It's a Mesopotamian story. It even includes the myth about the first rainbow coming after God flooded the world. We also know that the biblical flood never occurred because there existed great civilizations thriving during that time period. And they kept good records and never mention of a great flood that wiped them from the face of the earth. These civilizations includes the Chinese dynasty, the Egyptian dynasty, the Mesopotamian dynasty, the Sumerian, the Peruvian. And none mentions it. In reality, there was never a flood that covered the entire planet and destroyed the world. It's a fairy tale. The Bible is not a history book. It is not. There is no evidence of the existence of a Hebrew in Egypt. According to Exodus 12:40, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. The Bible mentioned Egypt about 700 times, yet there's no mentions of Israelites in any Egyptian history, nor in archaeology evidence outside of what the Bible says. Scriptures is not proof. Not at all. There is no evidence of a leader named Moses. There is no synagogue. There is no mention of the Jews or the 10 plagues in the extensive history of Egypt. We have no clue, not even a single word about the early Israelites in Egypt, neither in monumental inscriptions on the walls or the temples, nor on tomb inscriptions, nor written anywhere. Israel is absent as a possible foe of Egypt, as a friend, or as an enslaved nation. If the story of Israelites in Egypt was true, there would exist some evidence of it. But there's none. There's no evidence of Jews assimilating into Egyptian culture. It's a work of fiction. Furthermore, when we critically think, of course it didn't happen. To believe that story, you'd have to believe the ridiculous premise that 2 of every animals walk from across the planet and fit onto a large wooden ship built by a 500-year-old man. Come on, wake up to the reality. That means 2 penguins walk from the Arctic. Furthermore, the story of Shem and Ham, that's biblical story. The pyramid, the Great Pyramid, the Great Sphinx are older than them. So they were built, when they were built before the first Jew was even born. The story of Adam and Eve, the biblical scholars said Adam and Eve existed between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. The Great Sphinx is over 11,000, 12,000 years old. The Great Sphinx is older than Adam and Eve. So the story of Adam and Eve is a work of fiction. We must start functioning based upon what is true. When we divide ourselves based upon a fairy tale, we're making damn fools of ourselves. I say again, when we divide ourselves from Africans globally, based upon a biblical fairy tale written by our enemies, we are making damn fools of ourselves. Brothers and sisters, it's time to elevate our minds. It's time to wake up. It's time to stop playing hopscotch and start playing chess against our enemies. One love and peace.